Hello, everyone. My name is Luke Moody. I'm the creative director of Abandoned Normal Devices. Thank you for joining us on this Saturday evening premiere of The Grief Interval at the culmination of this year's festival edition. It is difficult to follow such beautiful and engrossing sounds and images with words, with articulate words, but we're going to try, and we're hosting a discussion this evening for you to participate in. We'd love to welcome and also thank the artist our Satz, the sound artist, composer, and musician Sarah Davachi, and Harry Sword, who's a writer and most recently an author of a book, Monolithic Undertow, exploring rituals and drone sound. So they're going to discuss this particular work, but also their work more in general. So please welcome Aura, Sarah, and Harry. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and I'm so happy to be here. And maybe I should just say that, well, my name is Aura Satz, as Luke said, and I'm a white woman in my 40s. I have brown curly hair, and I'm wearing a black t-shirt, and I'm broadcasting to you from my bedroom. I wanted to suggest that we run this conversation as a kind of three-way flow. And maybe just to start, I wanted to introduce the site that features in the film. So Fiddlers Ferry is a coal-fired power station, and it originally opened in 1971 and took water from the River Mersey. And it closed on the 31st of March 2020 after nearly 50 years of supplying electricity. The demolition was due to begin in 2020, and it can take up to 7 years. This is due to the fact that they'll have to use explosives to pull down the famous cooling towers, which you see featured in the film, which are an amazing 114-meter high architectural structures. And obviously, ecological studies will need to be prepared first to analyze the impact on breeding birds and other protected species in the area, but also there is asbestos that will need to be removed by specialists. So when I first thought of this project, it was really in relation to a larger project I've been working on for several years now on siren sounds. And for this project, I've been inviting composers, musicians to think with me and try to reimagine the siren sound and kind of open it up to a recalibration, kind of imaginative, speculative idea around how we might shift the frameworks of how we understand emergency, but also how we understand our responses to the emergency. And with regards to this site, when I was invited to make a piece that was kind of more site-specific, I immediately was struck by these incredible cooling towers, but also by the way in which they look like kind of organ pipes almost. And because I knew they were decommissioned, I had this idea that I could maybe play sounds from within them, or that I could think of them, even just metaphorically, as these kind of incredible, kind of large, monolithic, to use Harry's word, monolithic kind of musical instruments. And so I immediately thought of Sarah Davachi, whose work I'm a huge fan of her work and her kind of deep listening practice and sustain notes and work with organs in resonant spaces. And so I invited her to respond to the project, to think about sirens. And within this invitation, I suggested different iterations of the siren. So on the one hand, there's the siren as a preemptive warning, suggesting that there is some kind of danger that you can avert by heeding the siren's call. But also it's used for commemorative purposes and to kind of mark a silence, and around the idea of grief, which was really present in my mind for many reasons, but obviously the pandemic is kind of foregrounded. And so that was the invitation initially. And Harry's book has been incredibly influential. I think it's very recent. It's only been out in circulation for a few months. As far as I'm aware, though, I know it's a much longer research project. And there were so many different points in the book that resonated with my thinking, with the project. And so I thought this would be a really great opportunity to invite Harry into conversation. Sarah features in the book as well. So there's some nice kind of woven connections here. So I suppose I'm going to open up, when I said a three-way flow, what I was thinking of was that maybe we could each ask each other a question and just kind of circulate in that way across the screen and through our voices. So I wanted to start with the sound composition, because in effect that came first, and I used it. So I kind of provided a prompt for a piece of music and a kind of score of sorts by saying, think of it as a siren. But then I mentioned the site and described it and sent images and kind of and waited for the music to come in order to finalize how I would structure the film, how long it would be. So the music came first and is a kind of driving engine of the film. So maybe we could start, Sarah, if you could talk a little bit about the thinking behind the composition. You mentioned this idea of the pianto and the lament, which has been really resonant with my thinking as well. So maybe that's a good opening point for us.
Yeah, thank you, Aura. Well, so my name's Sarah Davachi. I have short, dark hair, I'm wearing headphones, and I'm in my studio in front of a white wall background. Yeah, the funny thing was that when you got in touch with me, Aura, I had this idea, and I don't know exactly how far back it dates, but there's this idea in music theory of this grief interval, which is the semitone, the minor second, and specifically a descending minor second. And historically, it's just been associated with the idea of grief or a lament. And I've always had it sort of flagged in my, composition notes that it was something I wanted to kind of focus on in some way. But I'd never really had the proper opportunity to do it. And so when Aura got in touch with me, just mentioning the idea of a siren, less as a call to attention and more as like a pause for reflection. That's kind of how I was thinking of it. My brain went immediately to this idea of the grief interval and exploring that. I think it expanded when I was working on the piece. It expanded a bit beyond that, and the grief interval itself ended up being sort of the transitionary movement between different parts of the composition. And yeah, when it was hard because usually when I do things that are specific to a space, like usually with organs, with pipe organs, it's such a direct connection between the acoustic space and what ends up coming out of the instrument. It's different because in those situations, I'm actually there and I am responding in a sense to what's happening acoustically. And in this situation, I couldn't do that. And when I saw the pictures and the completed film, the space was like overwhelmingly larger than I was expecting. I had an idea of what it was like, and of course I've never been inside of a cooling tower or anything on that similar man-made scale. But one of the things that I was thinking about when I saw it was that it was this interesting feeling between this obviously man-made object and then this almost like inhuman scale to it. Like it reminded me of like a natural, like a mountain or something like that, that's just sort of incomprehensibly large. And yeah, I mean, there's a lot that you can say about that in terms of instruments as well. I think sound, we often tend to, the way that we separate the sound that we're hearing from the means of production of it, like what's actually happening to produce that sound, is an interesting thing to me. And especially with organs, it's such an overlooked aspect of the instrument, that there's all of these really specific man-made parts to it, but the sound that actually generates from it is something that goes like above and beyond all of that. So that was something that was initially in my mind, and ideas about more generally about sirens and the idea of sound as something that can kind of create that pause. Like I began the piece with church bells, that I didn't want to necessarily create that trope throughout the entire piece, but I thought that it was sort of an elegant way to reiterate that idea of bells as sort of this thing that's announcing something that's happening, or creating this this framing for something else to occur. So
yeah,
right.
It's interesting hearing you talking about the church bells starting a piece. So I mean, something I write about in the book is the kind of difference, I think, between the sacred drone and what you could, I suppose, describe as the industrial drone. It strikes me that so often within sacred spaces, either by design, very often by design, we're seeking to maximize the reverberant potential of that space, in order to bring ourselves closer to spirituality, closer to God, closer to each other. But then when you have a look at a space like the space we've just seen, it's so diametrically opposed to that, in the sense that of the, like, as you were saying, in the sense of the scale. It's a kind of inhuman space, and I found it interesting seeing that from the inside. It was almost, I think, for me, it was almost like looking at the pyramids or looking at a sacred space somewhere that the meaning, the old meaning of the site was removed, because it's almost like trespassing. How often do you see inside a cooling tower? How often does anyone see it? I mean, it's, apart from the builders and a few engineers, it's this completely sense of removal from its function, and I think that thinking about sound and industry, the feeling I had was of overwhelming kind of dread, but also a fascination, and I used to have a dream when I was a kid of swimming through girders in an oil rig and looking up at the rig and feeling completely dwarfed by that, but also being slightly attracted to that. I think when we're dealing with structures like this, we're drawn towards them, perhaps because of their inhumanity. I think it's that's what the film spoke. Sorry, I've got slight connection issues. There we go. Yeah, I mean, and something I was wondering, Aura, I mean, thinking about the film's relationship to sound and going inside the towers, I mean, how did you actually get there physically? Because I don't think people, for anyone that doesn't understand the process, I'd just like to understand how you actually did it. I mean, I understand you were using flying drones and so on. I mean, how did you get in there?
Yeah, so there are some slightly vertiginous stairs to get into that bit, which is about halfway through, I think. Anyway, it's kind of in the middle, so we're not at the very bottom.
Oh, wow.
And then there's that little, what's featured at the opening of the film is like a kind of bridge, almost like this corridor that is the bit you can walk on, and the rest you can't walk on. And that bit surrounding is full of asbestos as well. We used drone cameras. It was a real privilege to be inside. The acoustics were incredible. So I kept imagining your piece, Sarah, like potential sound resounding in there. But I suppose before I got to the site, I wasn't able to do I wasn't able to visit it in advance due to COVID and all kinds of other reasons. And so I had some ideas, and I suppose the main one was this idea of circularity. And I was thinking of a few different things in relation to that. One is the siren sound and its kind of rise and fall, or in some cases it's kind of broadcasting across and around. But also I was thinking of like wax cylinders or kind of vinyl records, and this idea of the groove and the kind of sound, this drone sound kind of playing, or Tibetan singing bowl even.
Very much.
Sound kind of going around, and I had a feeling that the circularity of the camera movements would work well with the sound and kind of activate it and modulate it. And really that's something that I'm interested in as an artist that works with sound and film, is like how each can offset, or there's a kind of friction where they can push each other into a different kind of experience, in that the way that you're looking is inflected by how you're listening and vice versa. And so for me, you know, I've often worked with a soundtrack as the first kind of starting point, and then the film. And so the score is, as I said earlier, it's the engine of the film.
Yeah.
But I was wondering, for each of you, I suppose, Harry, you know, you've done a lot of very intense listening. You describe it beautifully.
Yeah.
In the book of kind of listening, you know, maybe with low lights or your eyes closed, and kind of really immersing yourself in the sound. And Sarah as well, like you're coming at it from an experiential perspective. But I wondered, I mean, you've talked a little bit about how the imposing architecture shifted where you were coming from in the first place. But I wondered if there was something else. Like for me, there are certain parts in the sound, especially towards the second half and at the very end, where the film says a possible pulse in the grief interval, where the pulse of the sound becomes foregrounded to me in a way that it wasn't on the first listening. And obviously, because I edited the film, I've listened to it many, many times, and I start to hear tiny ripples or undertows, again, to use metaphor, Harry. But, you know, it just, these kind of refractions start to emerge in the listening that I'm hearing, because the visuals are setting a kind of counter rhythm. That's something I feel happens quite effectively for me in my process, and I was wondering if that resonates with yours or your experience.
Yeah, Harry, do you want me to go first?
Yeah. Please.
Okay. Yeah, that's interesting that you say that. I mean, as somebody who, you know, I've played a lot of festivals and things like that where the idea is, oh, the sound is not enough, we should add some visuals to it. And that has always bothered me, because it's not, I don't understand the point of adding something that's not intentional, something that isn't with that in mind, that it's going to work with the sound, and having that idea that the sound is just not enough on its own, that people need something to look at.
Yeah.
And I feel like on the opposite side of that, the most like magical moments, I hate that word magical, but it works. The most magical moments that you have when you combine a visual element and a sonic element is when they are like symbiotic, when they do that, when you notice things in the sound that you wouldn't have before, and likewise with the visual element. And I also felt that one thing I was going to say about the visual element, you know, it's an interesting, the way that people think about minimalism in general and minimalist art, or at least one of the ideas that I like to subscribe to is, you know, just this idea that like you kind of are taking things out of context. Like when you look at, you know, a minimalist painting, like a Mark Rothko or something, you're just looking at a shape and a color essentially. And that's not all that you see. And the experience is not limited to that, but it forces you to remove any other associations that you have with that and really just give your attention to the color itself or the shape itself and explore that and what that feels like. And I noticed a lot of moments, there was a really nice balance, I thought, in the drone footage, that there would be times where you'd see like the, you know, the inside of the cooling tower, and you would get that, I think of it as the same kind of pulse that you're talking about, or of sort of the intricacies of the like brickwork on it, or you know, the details in that you're actually seeing that you wouldn't necessarily focus on without maybe having the sound give it that space to come out. And then likewise, when you would see, you know, from the bottom up, having just that like really stark image of the circle and that, you know, juxtaposition of inside and outside, that it was a similar feeling to me, that it really, like Harry said, it just removes so much context and creates a space for just viewing it as this other kind of thing. In a way, I think it's like kind of a romantic gesture to offer such a otherwise depressing building, you know, at the end of its life, so to speak, you know, this opportunity to exist as something else.
Yeah. I just wanted to interject though that like the grief is not towards the architecture, like obviously, and the like what I liked about the idea of the interval when you mentioned it in terms of like music theory was that this architecture is in a pause, it's in a state of kind of interval. It's an interval between paradigms of like energy and fossil fuel extraction. And it's too little, too late. And so like, although I'm really pleased that the film is like, in some ways it's much more beautiful than I thought it would be. I kind of, when I thought of the grief interval, I thought of it as like what we do as we are in this moment of the Anthropocene, kind of grieving what feels like the end of the world. And in that grief, how that grief is an interval that takes us towards the next steps or towards action. So that's partly my framing of it. But sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. And Harry, you were about to respond to Sarah, but I just wanted to like to put a tiny bit of perspective on my position.
I was just going to say that I found myself looking at individual bricks throughout the film, and they just these individual bricks alone, but they're part of this huge, almost. I mean, on one level, it's a kind of monstrosity in the sense of what it did and what it did until so recently. I was amazed actually to read about it, and only decommissioned in 2020. I was thinking, you know, some old power station that was probably decommissioned in the 80s, 2020, and yet it looks. It's so difficult to imagine it, you know, pumping out fossil fuels, but it was until last year. And but I found my gaze kind of moving towards the individual bricks, and then I found myself thinking, well, I can actually appreciate this structure on its own terms now, which is just, like I say, almost like looking at the pyramids or looking at some incredible, rather beautiful structure, you know. And it was an interesting. It wasn't the reactions I was expecting to have. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, in some of the sections of your book where you talk about kind of architectures that, you know, we don't know what their original intention was. We don't know if they were made to be resonant or they just happened to be resonant. And for me, the way I was thinking about this space as like a kind of toxic, inherently toxic space.
Exactly.
About to be demolished. So, you know, there's this phrasing in the film, which is it's kind of an architectural vault frozen in undetonated disaster. And that's because I've also been thinking about nuclear waste deposits and the same problem, you know, like, will they be the pyramids that in the future, you know, our descendants, whether they speak our language or not, how are we going to warn them of like these vaults of toxicity? Absolutely. That if they're on Earth, then, you know, it's like an Indiana Jones movie, you know, like, what's going to be.
You know, all architecture reveals intention. And I think the building you were talking about in the book, the Hypogeum, is, for anyone not aware of the Hypogeum, it's in Malta, just outside Valletta. It's a Neolithic burial chamber. It actually predates the pyramids. It's an extraordinary structure. It was discovered, I believe, in 1902, and 6 stories down. It's basically carved out of limestone. And within the Hypogeum, there's this chamber, a small room that's called, people call it the Oracle Chamber. And the resonance in the Oracle Chamber is particularly strong. It's like 14, 15 seconds. But along the wall, along the far wall, there's a little panel which looks very much like an acoustic resonator panel. And there's been a lot of debate as to whether this space was acoustically engineered, as it were, or whether it was perhaps acoustically engineered after the fact, after people realized that there was an incredible natural resonance down in the Hypogeum anyway. But in terms of intent, yeah, I mean, the intention behind a huge power station and the intention behind a sacred space couldn't be more different, you know. And it's just so interesting listening to different responses to sacred spaces and to industrial spaces. I mean, I think in terms of the Hypogeum, I think it's highly unlikely that anybody going down into that space wouldn't have noticed the incredible resonance. And given that we're talking 5,000 years ago, it may have been the only time that you would have ever experienced that kind of resonance. I mean, in modern life, every time we go into a multi-story car park, we've got resonance. Every time we go into, you know, the stairwell of an office, we've got kind of a 5-second reverb, you know. But if the only time you ever experienced that was down in this burial chamber, which was, you know, it didn't need to be there. It was there for a purpose. It was there for an intention to I think it's safe to say, to remember the dead, to honor the dead, you know. So I'm sure it was used in some respects. Whether or not it was acoustically engineered is another matter. It's interesting, you know, the response to the natural resonance of industrial spaces and how beautiful they can be. I mean, I know Sarah, in a lot of your work, you've worked in interesting spaces, and I think we were talking earlier or about Pauline Oliveros, you know, and the way that she used the cistern in Washington State, Fort Worden, which has a natural resonance of around 45 seconds, and that's an unbelievably foreboding, really creepy kind of place, you know. But the music she was creating was absolutely stunningly beautiful, and I just love the idea of repurposing a space which perhaps had initially had an ugly intention, or a violent intention, or a deeply destructive intention. And I think so much amazing work has come out of that. And it's interesting. I think we're drawn to these spaces. I think we are drawn to these spaces, you know. And it's just interesting to see people's reactions to them. So,
yeah, I think that was sort of an unexpected reaction I had when I saw the film. Like I said, that it gave the structure a different purpose for a moment before its, you know, imminent destruction. And I don't know if it's something that either of you thought about, but one thing in a way I felt like kind of sad for the structure.
Yeah.
Especially knowing that, you know, it's different with you know, centuries old structures, or even like a car park or something like that, that, you know, it doesn't have this connotation of destruction and, you know, just this sort of overwhelmingly negative connotation. And even in the way that the cooling tower is going to be dismantled, which is via explosions, basically just being imploded. There was. Yeah.
Sorry, there's a bit of interference. There are lots of, I think, similar industrial spaces that have been repurposed as, you know, cultural spaces, or I think I saw a nuclear power plant that was turned into a kind of, what are those things called, like an merry-go-round? Anyway, but what I think is really interesting in some of the things that you're saying is, I hadn't thought of it in this way, but I think the film is also a kind of burial site for the piece of architecture. It's to kind of commemorate it and hold it as a space for a question. A question, because I really feel like, you know, we're in this moment on so many fronts. So not just the time frame of the pandemic, but, you know, prior to this, the build-up of our understanding of the immensity of climate catastrophe and where we're heading. So we have this moment where we're both hopeful and totally kind of apocalyptic about the future. And so we have these dinosaur behemoth kind of structures, relics of this bygone age of industry, where industry meant progress and future, and, you know, like new communities built around industry. And I think now the understanding is that those communities were kind of built around threat as well.
Yeah.
You know, and that the toxicity, you know, like the understanding, the kind of scar of understanding all the damage that's been done, and trying to imagine ways forward, trying to think into that kind of distant, unimaginable future, is a kind of exercise in itself. So I think, like, for me, that was the prompt, and the curiosity towards the building is like, yeah, it was totally amazing to be inside it and around it. It was really beautiful and kind of intoxicating in that way. And at the same time, there was this real sense of an ending of an era and an uncertainty around how we face forward, which is what my kind of Siren project is about. And so this kind of encapsulation of both this sense of dread towards a future, but also mourning or grief towards something that's happened or that may happen is kind of that space that I was trying to inhabit. And actually, when the music came through, Sarah, I think I wrote this to you, I really felt that it spoke to me in so many ways, because it took the grief that I've been feeling, personal, ecological, just on all these different fronts, and it articulated it in a way that was really soothing as well. Like listening to it has been very healing, even as I go deeper into the grief.
Thank you.
And so it's been a really beautiful kind of both the making of the film, but editing it, like listening again and again, going deeper and deeper and deeper into the layers of the sound. It's just been a real privilege. I've been really grateful to have that. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I mean, yeah, and it's interesting. In a lot of my work, not all of it is like intentionally mournful. I think it just ends up being that way, a lot of it. But of the things where that idea does come into play, it's always been interesting to me that there is that dichotomy almost of like, there's the grief aspect of it, which has all the obvious connotations of sadness and lament and all of that. But then there's an aspect of like comfort about it. There's this not like pleasurable, but there's something that you need, in a sense, something that is good for you, that comes out of it. And I mean, another visual connection that I was making when I was watching the film, and Harry, you were kind of mentioning something similar, which I thought was interesting. I mentioned that it reminded me of a mountain, of like the feeling of a mountain. But another thing that I felt was, I remember like as a kid, I would always be scared of large bodies of water, because the idea of being so deep under something was terrifying to me. But at the same time, it was also intriguing in the idea that it's like, it's just this thing that's overwhelming you and you kind of lose yourself in it. And that's kind of an interesting idea, especially in relation to nature and things that are just there naturally. And I had a similar sensation every time the camera went to the top. I just got this feeling, this simultaneous feeling of like suffocation, in a sense, of just being so lost in something so much bigger than me, but also, like this is kind of comfortable, and there's something womb-like, to use that term, I guess. You know what I mean? There's something like,
I think that's so interesting, because I think so often when we're dealing with sustained tones and so on, and the drone, a very common response is for people to say exactly that. It's a kind of sense of womb-like immersion, I think. And if we actually if we have to take it back to the womb, the first sound we hear, well, there's two sounds. There's the sound of the rushing of the maternal blood, and there's the beating of the maternal heart. So I think we've got a kind of a connection from day dot with these two sounds, with the 4/4 and with the drone. And there was a study, actually, it was done, I believe, at Cornell University, the early 90s, and they measured the level of sound in utero that the fetus was exposed to, and it was 80 decibels, which is like,
wow.
It's really loud. It's like a car wash. So it's not just, we have this idea of the womb as being this kind of really quiet, kind of chilled out environment. Actually, sonically, it's very, very loud down there. And and that's the other thing about the drone, is that the idea of eternity, I think that's something that everyone, no matter the religion, no matter the culture, everyone has to reckon with the idea of eternity. And I've never met anybody whose head isn't completely spun by the concept. It's just like, it's
incomprehensible.
Being human is to have the mind blown by the concept of something not ending, because we're painfully aware every day that our lives will end, and that's a big part of being human. We know we're on a journey that's going to end, and I think that feeds into a lot of music that makes use of sustained tone. Is the idea of eternity and the idea of a circle. You're removing the kind of traditional markers of time, removing verse, chorus, verse, removing the bridge, removing all of these structures that people can hang their, what's the word, that people can kind of hang their, if you know what's coming, you know what's coming. If you don't know what's coming, you're put in a very different headspace. It's I always just, in the sense of, if I'm at a kind of stadium rock show, the idea is that I'm in a crowd of 80,000 people, and here comes the bridge, and here comes the chorus, and it's a communal experience, and it's predicated on the idea that everyone knows precisely what's coming, and you pretty much know what the person next to you is thinking and feeling. Whereas one of your shows, or say you go and see Earth or someone, it's totally different. Haven't got a clue what the person next to you is experiencing. And I love that. It's such an individual response.
Yeah, I agree. We have to wrap up in a second, but I just maybe wanted to end on another person who features in your book, and I know is a huge influence for all of us here, is Eliane Radig, and her idea that like everything is vibration, and the music is just a little cutout, really, of what is ongoing. So that idea of the drone as a kind of little framing of the continuity of vibration, whether they're microscopic and whether they're perceptible or whether they're completely kind of,
Yeah, I mean, that feeds right back to the Om. If you look at Hindu theology, Buddhist theology, the idea is that it's sound as God. So the sound, it's from the Om that everything else springs. And it's right there in theology. There's a brilliant quote I heard the other day. I would have included it in the book if I'd heard it in time. It was from Shane McGowan. He was saying, "Look, I don't write songs. I just pluck them out of the ether, and I have to get it before Paul Simon gets it." So it's like you've just got to kind of be receptive to it, and that kind of feeds into what you were saying about Radig. It's the idea of vibration and the idea of being open to what's happening around you is I think quite intrinsic. I mean, how do you feel about that, Sarah, in your composition and in your practice?
I think we have to stop now, I'm afraid, because we've run out of time. But let's continue the conversation another time, maybe off screen. Sure. This has been such a wonderful opportunity to exchange ideas with you, and sounds and processes and experiences. So I'm really grateful. Thank you so much. And
thanks very much for having me.
Thank you so much for thinking of me for this.
Thanks very much.